is late in the day, and I am riding in the wagon with my father to make his deliveries. "Tata," I ask, "why did you stop being a rabbi and start selling pots and buckets?" My father smiles at my inquisitiveness. "Because I like to sell pots and buckets." We ride for a long time in silence before Tata speaks again. "Sometimes one cannot do everything one wants, Boshka. It is better for Mamala and your brothers and you for me to sell things than for me to be a rabbi. I sell things to keep you safe. Someday you'll understand." I don't say anything, but though I am only 12, I already understand. Too much. I know about the rabbi who was dragged from his house by the Tsar's men and never seen again. I know about the pogroms. I know about the men conscripted and never heard from again. I can't imagine not being able to do things I want to do, I say. Tata smiles, but his eyes are sad. "I know, Boshka. I know."
Why I wrote Bessie's poem. First of all, I loved the stories. I kept hearing these stories. It was my mother that just kept telling these stories about her mother, because she just thought her mother was amazing, and she just kept saying these stories have to get out. So I wrote this because I love the stories, and my mother told me to write it. She had told me to write this story since I was 6 years old back in New Rochelle. She told us constantly. At the same time, my mother and father opened a toy shop in Scarsdale. The little Heathcote toy and party shop became this little icon. There were always people coming into the store from New Rochelle, from Scarsdale, that were in the publishing business, or they were writers. So everyone my mother saw, she said, "I have this book." It could be a movie, she wasn't particular, but she had it all in her head, all these stories. The one in particular was Carl Reiner. He was in the store all the time because he was doing, what was the show? Dick Van Dyke Show. And he lived right there, so he was always in the store. And Brian's our son, and he produces TV shows, and he was living in LA. And he said one night in a restaurant, there's Carl Reiner. And he ran up, and he's sitting with his whole family and friends, and my son goes, "Heathcote Toy Shop?" And he jumped up. And he said, "Of course," and he starts poking his wife, remember? So my mother kept saying, "Carl Reiner's going to be the one. He'll write the story for me." Well, he didn't. And by 2003, my mother's still telling the stories. And I'm going to tell you how I wrote it and how this whole thing came to be. So it's now 2003, and my mother was on the phone with me every single night for an hour or more telling me all these stories. And now it got to the point, and she was sharp as a tack, but she was forgetting a name. So now I'm filling in. Okay, so I know every single story. And I'm telling her, no, that happened there, no, this was here, and because we all know these stories. So I taped her. I then sat there like a crazy lady, taking all the tapes, and I put it all together, piles and piles and piles. This story happened in 1930, this one happened in 1940, this one happened in 1910, and I had all these papers. I finish it, and I say to my mother, "Okay, I have this." She says, "Good. Send it to Carl Reiner." This is the truth. She says, "Send it to Carl Reiner." So at this point, I say to her, "Actually, I think we're better off with Rob Reiner at this stage." And this was the honest truth. She says to me on the phone, "Didn't I teach you anything? Why would you go to his kid? You go right to the top. You go right to Carl Reiner." And poor Brian is always calling. He was always calling her. He was always over there, and she kept saying to him, "Brian, make a movie." He kept saying, "Grandma, you don't understand. First we need a book." "Well, your mother's not writing it." Because she wanted me to write this book. And so finally, Brian got all the addresses, We researched it. We sent to Carl Reiner. We sent to Rob Reiner. We sent to everybody. We still haven't heard. Okay, now, so then my mother says, so write the book. They're not answering you. So I say to her, we've written books. This is the reason she kept saying you can write a book. My husband and I have written a lot of books. We've sold over 1 million children's books. Why Bad Grades Happen to Good Kids. I've been talking all over the place just about that book. Now we have Why Bad Grades Happen to Good Teachers. Okay, but I don't write novels. And I'm trying to tell her that. She said, so you'll learn. So what I do now, I go to someone who we know, he lives right near us. We're up in Mayapack, he's over in Somers, and he's a retired writer. He won 2 Emmys, and we're with him at lunch one day, and we said to him, I said, I have this book. I have it all here. Can you help me write it? So he said, I'm almost 80. I don't think I want to write any more books, but give it to me. So I give it to him, and he calls me and he says, you know, you have a good story here. You have an actual story. So he said, but to tell you the truth, you're going to have to do so much research with history. And I'm doing all this other business between the tutoring and the books. I'm thinking, how am I going to do all this research? I don't know what am I going to do with it. Now, this is a great story, true. All these stories are true. I'm still walking around with all these papers. This is from 2003. My mother's now living in assisted living. And she calls up, she needs something with the dentures, and our dentist, he's on a tout tour in India somewhere, and I've got to get her to a dentist. So the people at the assisted living say, right across the street, there's a wonderful dentist. So we go over to him, Pete the dentist, and he's working on my mother's teeth. And as usual, a dentist is talking and talking and talking, and you can't answer them, and they're going on and on. And I'm sitting in the room with her, and he's telling her, I'm taking a writing course at NYU. Okay? So the minute he takes all this stuff out of her mouth, she says, I've got a book for you. This is good. This is good. And he looks at me, and I said, we do. We have a book. So he said he goes over to the assisted living with tape recorders, and he's taping my mother, and he's calling us, and he's going, I think I fell in love with Bessie. I love this book. So he starts writing it, and then he calls and he says, I have to walk away. I just handed it to my wife. She said, you wrote an outline. You don't have a book here, and we're going to go out of business. We have 4 kids to put through college. You're a dentist. I can't worry about this book. And he tells me this on the phone. I said, I don't blame you. And I also learned that he had taken just 1 course in short stories 101. So he was out of the question. There goes that. So I'm still walking around with my book from my mother. Okay, so now, guess who ends up writing this? Me. So Al finally said to me one day, you have everything. You know these stories. We know them by heart. Sit down and just start writing it. And I literally kept thinking, Bessie was my height. It's family. She must have been thinking the same. And I started putting it together to get a voice. And I start typing. I'm reading to Al, and he's going, actually, it's not bad. Keep going. This is not bad. You're putting it together. So I sat down. I created an outline. I saw through all the stories, which were millions of them, put them in a logical order. Then I call my mother and I say, okay, what happened between 1907 and 19 blah, blah, and I'm going through this. And she says, how do I know? You're the writer. And she said, you're the writer. I said, you made me do this. I said, how do I know what to put in? She says, it's a novel. It's historical fiction. Put in whatever you want. So I would say 95% of the book is true, and about 5% I created a little bit because I had to fill in, where else am I going to go here? And I've learned that that's historical fiction, and that's perfectly okay. But the most of it is actually true. So now I start researching, And I find out that writing a novel is as easy as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It became unbelievable. I was so obsessed with this thing. And then she'd call me in the morning. At 9 o'clock, I knew that phone's ringing. I'm going, oh, God. Did you include when Uncle Max, and then she goes into the whole story again. I have to tell you, she went through these stories so much. I would be taking it to the doctor. It could be the eye doctor. It could be anyone. They say, how are you today? Did you know that my father? And then she'd start with the whole story, and they'd look at me and they'd go, she's cute. And we'd sit there, we'd have to go through the entire story again. So anyway, so now I began in 1900, and that's what you were listening to a few seconds ago. How many, by the way, did read the book so far, so you know what I'm talking about? Okay. A lot of you haven't, so I'm going to be very careful because I don't want to give away any part. Okay, so I began in 1900, and this is the story. My mother kept saying, make sure you put in that when she used to go with her father. See, her father was a rabbi. They lived well. They had maids. They had gardeners. They lived in Lithuania, outside of Vilna, in a town called Glabuka, which I don't know if Nancy remembers that Glabuka. I thought it was made up. I kept hearing, and I met someone, and she said to me, oh, that's a beautiful little town. I said, really? There's a town, Glabuka? So there's truly this little town, and they lived well. But he was explaining to her the reason I'm not a rabbi anymore. The rabbis were being killed. The pogroms were coming through, and Bessie herself told my mother, and she said, well, if I was home alone, my parents told me, start yelling men's names. Make believe the house is filled with men. Just start yelling men's names. Bessie wanted to get out of there, okay? So what I did was I began in 1900 with Bessie with her father, and then I moved right on to 1906. And this is when Bessie left. This is the only part I'm going to read one page in the book. This is in 1906. This is now, she's 18 years old. They had taken a horse and buggy from Glabuka to Vilna, and now she's taking a train to leave her parents forever and her whole family forever to get to America all by herself. Now, she's 18 years old, okay? And she said, my father's voice interrupts my reverie. Tell your brothers goodbye now, Bashka. I nod and give each of them a hug. Max, Jack, I say while holding both their hands, I will send for you once I'm settled. I'll find a way to get you to America. You won't have to go into the army, I promise. They smile at me and nod, though I can tell that they do not believe me. I reach out to hug Tata when someone taps my shoulder. And I have to tell you something, this next part, every so often, I was talking to my sister, and we're saying, did they put this together, those two mothers in Glabuka? I just wonder. Okay, so now they're at the train station waiting for the train. A woman comes over and taps her on the shoulder. She says, I hope you remember me from Glabuka. I am Chana. I couldn't help overhearing that you're traveling to New York. My son is there, and I need to get something to him. She had made him a pillow, and he had forgotten it. And she said, my cousin was supposed to be here, but I can't find her. And I heard you're going to New York. Will you find him and give it to him? Okay? Then Tata looks, and he says, oh, take it. That's why we said, wait a minute. How did she take this pillow? Did they put this together somehow? We never knew, and this is a true story. She put the pillow into this bag, and she looks down at the pillow. In the midst of the flowers, there is a Yiddish phrase, may this pillow bring you peace. I open one of my bags and push the pillow into it. How will I find him? She says his name is Nathan. I don't want to say the last name, so that if you haven't read the book yet. And she said, and we put in the book, go to an aid society for immigrants in New York. It's called the Glabuka Society. Now, my mother kept telling us it's called the Glabuka for Rain. Al and I were on that computer. There is no such thing as the Glabucker Forain. We're looking and we're looking, and she keeps saying, you two don't know what you're doing. I'm sure it's there. Keep looking, the Glabucker Forain. I was just speaking at Asher Shalom in New Rochelle. This young rabbi raises his hand. He says, because the word isn't forain, it's vorain. So if any of you want to look up anything, it's not forain. You can find, what they did was when they got here, everyone knew each other from that town, and everyone knew where everybody went. And you could go into the city, and you could find where they were. So she takes this, she writes it down, and she says, and where is he? And she says, he's in a place called New Rochelle. And so the story takes place in New Rochelle. She came here first class, and which is interesting because we were trying to figure out how did she come here first class, and we found out that if she didn't, she was all by herself at 18, they would never let her go through. But somehow they got her onto the first class. She came here, never actually went to the Lower East Side, ended up which became Washington Heights. The subway had just been built, and she had friends up there. And then from there, the story goes on. Okay, so now, I finished chapter 1. I finished at that point. And I called my mother, and I said, listen to this. This is chapter 1. And I start reading, and she stops me after one page, and she says, it's enough. I know this story. What are you reading it to me for? She never heard the rest. She would not let me read it to her. She always said to me, I'm telling you, what are you reading back to me? I don't need the story. I know it. Okay, so she never heard it because she didn't want to hear it. And I would be on the phone with my daughter, and she's up in Massachusetts. She's a chemistry professor, has nothing to do with this, but loved all the stories because whole family knew the stories. And at night, I'd say, Cheryl, listen, Grandma won't even listen to the chapter. And I'm reading, and the two of us are crying, and she's and we're going through it. She took the final thing, Cheryl, and her husband, and a friend of theirs also, and they went through again for the editing just to see it. Brian hasn't. Well, he just keeps telling us, Mom, everyone likes it because they're friends, and they're relatives. He keeps saying, I said, did you read it? I'm up to the ship. And he hasn't gotten too much further at this point. Okay, so that's chapter 1. Al's the editor. I finished the book. I'm all done. Al's #1 editor. And we realize we better get an editor, a real editor. Al's a retired physics teacher. He's got his doctorate in physics and math. And I'm thinking, he's my editor. We got a problem here. So, but he actually did rather well. Okay, now I'm at a luncheon. And I'm sitting at this luncheon, and this young girl, Jennifer, is sitting next to me. How she ended up next to me, like, who knows? And we're talking, and what do you do? And she says, I'm a writer. I said, you're a writer? I said, I have a book about my grandmother. It takes place in 1906 from Lithuania. And she says, oh, I just came back. I was there for 2 years. And I went, it was the weirdest thing. I'm going, is Bessie putting her, like, how did she end up next to me? This was unbelievable. So she said, I really don't have time. So I said, well, I wrote it. I need someone to take it that really knows how to do a novel. She said, I'd love to look at it, but I'll talk to you after I read it. So she takes it, and she calls me up, and she says, I think I fell in love with Bessie. Same thing as Pete the dentist. She said, I'll work on this. She said, I would love to work on this with you. Then she calls me one night, and she said to me, okay, this is spooky. First, we end up sitting next to each other. She said, now she lived in an apartment building. She's in her early 30s. She said, I go down to do the laundry. There's a coin at the bottom of the washing machine. I take out the coin. It was a nickel from 1906. So she said, I almost wasn't going to call you because it's just weird. What was that? We have the coin. She ran over with it, and she gave us the coin. Who knows? The next thing that was strange was now we need a cover for the book. And someone here in Riverdale gave me the name of someone. He was great. We started working with him. And I'm talking to him one night. I said, how long have you lived in Riverdale? He says, where's that? So I said, where am I talking? Where are you? He says, Attleboro, Massachusetts. You probably never heard of it. I said, that's in the book. Bessie's brother, Max, does come here, doesn't stay in Urshel, and he ends up in Attleboro. He goes, are you kidding? I said, Max Markman. And he said, who is that man? He said, there's a school named after Max Markman. There's a park, which we know. And I said, that's Bessie's brother. Because the minute he got here, World War I broke out. He went back to fight for this country, came back and set up the American Legion, became the head of it in Attleboro. And so that is, I said, that's why you know the name. He said, I finally found out who Max Markman is. So he's the one that actually did our cover. Finally, it's finished, we thought. We were hoping to have it all done by October, and I get a phone call from my mother on a Sunday morning, on September 16th. She had a heart attack, and she died September 20th. So she did not see the final book, but I don't think she wanted to. She wouldn't. She wouldn't even listen to me to tell her what was in it. So now somehow something happened October, I don't know what happened, and now we're up to November, and I said, this book's coming out. I'm just finishing this book. We now send it to somebody in Denver who works with us, and she's a retired history professor, and she's a historian. And we said, just before we print this, check all the facts so we didn't mess anything up with history. So she's reading it, and we get a phone call, and she says, it needs more history. You didn't put enough history in here. Are you kidding? I have to put more history into this? So we put all this history into it. She's researching and researching, calls us about Alsace-Lorraine, about our grandfather's side. I said, no, just let's stick to Bessie. I've got to finish this book. She's done. We send it to Valley, who does all our other books. She does the layouts, and she gets it ready for the final publication. And she calls us, and she says, you have too much history in here. That's how, if Bessie's America, she has in there the dances that were going on, because the book goes from 1906 to 1936. It's what was happening to America during that whole era. It was the whole turn of the century with all the immigrants coming here. And we put together Bessie's America, and bessiespillow.com is a website set up just for the book, and you can go, it's totally interactive. You'll know what's going on in the news, you'll know the politicians, you'll know the foods. Baked Alaska was developed during that time, and even gives recipes. It's a kind of fun thing, but that's what happened with all that history. Now, let's go, why did I write it? I said because I liked it. What was it, though? Millions of people came here during that time. So what is it that at this point it won an award? People all seem to love it. I still love it. I still want to go back and read it. What is it about this particular book? Because she did not become rich. She did not become famous, except in Urshel. Everyone knew Bessie. But what was it about her that is making people gravitate towards this book? She escaped from persecution, like many, many, many. She had courage, obviously, to go by herself at 18. There's a love story when you read it. There is a triangle, and there's a little love story in there. The tragedy, everyone thought they're coming to America. Well, there's no penicillin. There was no antibiotics. The streets weren't paved with gold. And these people had a tough time, and she had it better than a lot who ended up on the Lower East Side. So the tragedy, but her perseverance and her survival. What did it? We were trying to analyze it. She was independent. She did not want to come here that somebody's going to take care of her. She was a very independent woman. She was a businesswoman. She ran the family business. And when they bought the house in 1918 in Urshel, it's her name. She's the one that bought it, not my grandfather. The other thing, my mother kept telling me stories. She had mortgages all over the dining room table that she was giving out to the milkman, the fruit and vegetable man. And my mother said, I'm in the bank one time on Main Street in Urshel, and there's this very, very elegant Protestant president of the bank with the little pinch glasses, and she said, I'm standing next to my mother. And he walks over and he says, just because you learned how to sign your name, you have to stop giving everybody money. And she turned to him. My mother said, I'm standing there. And she said, she says, are you going to give them a mortgage? He says, of course not. Good, I will. They deserve a house just like you deserve a house. And she was giving out all these mortgages. There was a child that was sick in New Rochelle, and he had to go to Grasslands. If anyone know Westchester, it became the Westchester Medical Center. They needed the money. My mother said, we're the ones that went door to door to collect money. And he had the operation, and he survived. Another time, she said, well, every holiday, Rosh Hashanah would come. She said, we were in that kitchen making challahs and honey cake, and we drove around, gave it to everyone on the street where we lived. It didn't matter who they were, what religion they were getting for the new year a challah and honey cake. And so she said, my sister brought this up, which I thought was hysterical, on our own street there where we all lived. Across the street were the Italians, next door were the Irish. It was just this whole little melting pot. And my sister said, I'd stand, because my best friend was across the street, they were Italian. And the two grandmothers would stand, Bessie and this other grandmother, talking to each other. Thick Italian accent, the thick Jewish accent. And my sister said, I used to look, because they'd be laughing. How do they know what each other is saying? She said it was unbelievable. But she said she became everybody's friend in New Rochelle, and everyone knew her. The funniest part, I thought, was, my mother said she had us selling tickets. One of her customers wanted to be an opera singer. And Bessie said, let's give him a chance. So she bought out the movie theater on Main Street. She bought it out, and my mother said, we had tickets now all over the dining room table, and we're selling to all our teachers. And we all get dressed up that night to hear this man sing. She said, we were almost under the seats. He was so bad. We were so hysterical. She said, when we walked out, we said, how could you do that? She said, it doesn't matter. He had a chance. It didn't work. But she said this was the type of woman she was. Okay, she was strong character, obviously. She was grateful for hands extended and paid the kindnesses forward. But Bessie's story isn't just Bessie. It's everybody's story. We're all immigrants in this country. It's about the real American dream, the one lived by countless millions who will forever remain unknown, but to whom we owe everything.